Hello everybody and welcome back. Today I am doing my 2018 book stats. I have not done this video before because last year I was new to BookTube, but this year I decided that I wanted to do it because I wanted to see how my stats measured up, so to speak. I am sitting because holding a laptop while standing is just entirely too much work, and also just awkward. Let's get started. First of all, I am not doing charts or anything fancy because I don't like Excel or numbers quite that much. So you're just gonna have to listen. I'm sorry. Second of all, we're gonna start with genre. I read a fairly wide variety of genres. I don't read horror or thriller because I'm a chicken and I don't like them. But I do read historical fiction, contemporary, some, fantasy, science fiction, classics, nonfiction, and this year I read graphic novels and comic books, and I also read some poetry. Let's start with the lower numbers. I read 4 poetry books. All of 4, because I don't read a lot of it, and it's hard for me to find poetry books that I actually enjoy. I read 2 comic books. One was the first Shuri episode by Nettie Okafor, and the other one was a free one that I got with that order. Something about Marvel and War of the Worlds Prelude or something. And I read 2 graphic novels, both by Nathan Hale, both nonfiction, and both, I don't know if they're middle grade or YA, but younger. They were about the Civil War, called The Big Bad Ironclad, and World War I, which is called Treaties, Trenches, Mud, and Blood. I love that series. There's 7 or 9 of them in it right now, and they're a great way to learn history. Now going back up to the bigger genres. For historical fiction, I read 23 total. 2 of them were YA, 18 of them were adult historical fiction, and 1 of them was middle grade historical fiction. As far as contemporary books go, I read a total of 8, 1 of which was middle grade, 4 of which were adult, and 3 of which were YA. I know Everything was in there, and Crazy Rich Asians, but those are the only 2 I remember off the top of my head. Fantasy was my most read genre this year, which shocked me a little bit, but ever since about high school, fantasy and historical fiction have kind of been switching off years almost. This year I read 41 YA fantasy, 9 adult fantasy, and 22 middle grade fantasy, which is, oh, I should have done this math beforehand. That's 50, 72. I read 72 fantasy total. And then as far as science fiction go, I didn't read any young adult science fiction, but I read 3 adult science fiction and 1 middle grade science fiction. Again, I don't really remember what the middle grade one was, so it clearly made an impression. I did read 11 classics this year as well, which I am quite proud about. I didn't double up any of my books either. So for example, War of the Worlds is both science fiction and a classic that I read this year, but I included it in the science fiction portion as opposed to the classics portion, I think. But I know I didn't double it up because I have a whole bunch of papers and there's one that's scribbled out that I distinctly remember about War of the Worlds. Let's see. Ooh, yes. So that's all the books I read. Oh, I suppose I should tell you how many books I read this year. I read 148 books this year. I'm on the fence about claiming that it's actually 148. At the very least, it is 146, because comic books, they sort of make me feel like I'm cheating. They're very tiny, you know, all of like 5 pages, but Goodreads has them, and so they went into my Goodreads count. My Goodreads goal for the year was originally 100, and then I hit that in, I think, August, so I changed it to 125 and then surpassed that a while ago. So I've read 146 or 148, depending on whether you count comic books. As far as page numbers go, I have read 48,668 pages total, which is disappointing to me because last year I read 131 books and 49,976 pages, I think it was. 49,000 and some odd pages at any rate, and I really wanted to beat my page count from last year because the number of books I've read has increased since I've been doing the Goodreads challenge in earnest. But I didn't quite get to 50,000 pages, so that's a goal for 2019 that I forgot to mention in that video. Anyway, my longest book was my Lord of the Rings bind-up at 1,178 pages. I have, I guess, a variety of shortest books because I read a lot of audiobooks this year, and audiobooks obviously don't have actual pages. So Goodreads kept telling me that the audiobooks that I read were the shortest, in which case it could have been any of the Harry Potters, it could have been The Hobbit, it could have been War of the Worlds, The Wraith, Silence of the Girls, a couple others. But as far as physically being the shortest, it is The House of Lords and Commons by Ishii Hutchinson at a whopping 65 pages. That is also a poetry book though, and poetry books are not known for their length. As far as the format of books that I read, like I said, I read a lot of audiobooks this year, which I'm surprised about, but considering how much driving I did this year, it does make sense. In November alone, I listened to audiobooks for 58 hours, which had jumped up from I think about 38 hours in October. I was just driving all over. Grand Forks is kind of isolated, and so when I was going to interviews or going to visit my family in Duluth, it was anywhere from a 5 to a 7 hour drive. You get a lot of audiobooks done when you're driving 5 to 7 hours every other week. That said, I read 18 audiobooks. I read 4 books on Kindle, all of which were read when I went to the UK for my friend's wedding. I had the 8-hour flight across the Atlantic from Minneapolis, and so I read then, and then I had a couple of 2-hour train rides, and so I read on my Kindle then because I read my Kindle when I travel that far. And one of them was also a poetry book, Milk and Honey, actually, and then I read 126 physical books. I do still very much so prefer physical books, I always will. There's just something about the smell of them and the weight of them that is more comforting and more immersive than reading an audiobook or a Kindle. And the last stat that I'm just going to talk about is male versus female. I read 41 male authors, 4 of which were people of color, and 63 female authors, 17 of whom were people of color. I definitely read a lot more female authors. I realized this when my friend Katie was in Nicaragua because we had this whole conversation. She was recommending me a book where the women characters are killed off with alarming frequency, and I made a comment that they weren't in a lot of the books I read, and she said, yeah, because you read more female authors. It's true. I read a lot of female authors, and I'm not mad about it. I don't try one way or another. I just buy the books that look appealing. I don't overly care what the author does, to an extent. So, yeah, 41 male, 63 female, and let's see, 41 and 63 is 104 with 21, so about 20% of the authors that I read were people of color, which is decent considering even a year ago it would have been even more so predominantly white. Then the last one, I'll put a picture of it across the screen, but that is just sort of the ratings that I've done for the year. For ratings, I did not rate 2 of them. One of them because it just made me uncomfortable enough that I think I would have given it an unfair rating based on the content and how it made me dislike feeling, and the other one for very different reasons. I only had 1 1-star rating, which is good, always good, 2 2-star ratings, one of which I continued in the series, and the other was the last one that was out in the series, and I will not continue with that one. Then I had a fair bit of 3 stars, and most of my books seemed to be 4 stars, so it was a good reading year. I reread, I think, 18 books. I did the math the other night because I took the bar, and I can't read new stuff while I'm trying to cram everything into my head like Sisyphus. Stupid Barbary. And then I had a fair number of 5-star reads as well, so this was actually a really good year for me in terms of ratings and liking the books. Looking at 2017, I had a lot more 4-star ratings, but I didn't have any 1-star or no ratings, even though I had 4 2-stars. So I think I improved this year given that I read almost 20 books more than I did last year. that is all I have for my book stats for the year of 2018. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!